Hasan Spiker writes in his book Nafs al-Amr, Things as They Are, in his critique of Immanuel Kant, and I quote, "The conclusion that synthetic a priori propositions in metaphysics are impossible, that is, that the real extension of human knowledge via metaphysical demonstration as traditionally understood is impossible, once again turns out to be founded on several of Kant's unproved assumptions, which are consequences of those already discussed. Most foundationally, that which states that, as the Kantian scholar W. H. Walsh has expressed it, if a proposition purports to be both factual and non-empirical, it cannot be true. This is founded on the notion that factual propositions are only such propositions as state a fact of empirical experience, that is, the synthesis of sensibility and understanding as defined by Kant. As Walsh pointed out in his 1939 article, Kant's Critique of Metaphysics, this assertion of Kant's is unduly dogmatic. Walsh lists several propositions promulgated by Kant, such as there are categories and sense and thought cooperate in knowledge, that purport both to be facts and must be a priori according to Kant's own logic, even though they are undoubtedly non-empirical. Moreover, Kant's assumption rests on a dogmatic denial of the very thing metaphysics claims, that the senses are not the only source of knowledge. Though all empirical propositions are factual, there is no reason in principle why all factual propositions should be empirical, in the sense of based on sense experience. For it might be the case that we had some other source of information than the senses, and if we thus had insight into an intelligible world, we could assert propositions about it. Apart from the many unproven assumptions that constitute the foundation of Kant's critical project, then, there are several instances of what appear to be formal inconsistencies in Kant's first critique. One of the most famous is the question of how things in themselves can be known to have a causal relationship in bringing about the effectivity of the knowing subject in sensation, when this implies the very application of the concept of cause beyond possible experience. Now, just to step back from this, it's important to note that Kant asserts a empiricist or empirical approach to the questions of metaphysics and a priori propositions. Kant asserts that a priori propositions must correspond to the world, to the outside empirical world, and they must correspond to empirical facts. As such, synthetic a priori propositions are impossible. However, what Kant fails to understand is that he himself uses these synthetic a priori propositions to develop and expand his worldview. He bases his arguments off of these synthetic a priori propositions, and furthermore, he ignores how the whole metaphysical and philosophical project in the first place is only possible by these synthetic a priori principles. And it's ironic that Kant would censor traditional metaphysics for this kind of dogmatism, but he himself falls into the same usage of principles that he accuses traditional metaphysics of employing. Furthermore, his accusations of dogmatism are quite ironic given that he believes in God on the basis of corruption of morals. And his idea that we should believe in God, otherwise morals will be corrupted, it's not a very strong argument for the existence of God. The traditional metaphysical and philosophical arguments that maintain God's existence can be proven by rational, inductive, or deductive arguments are much stronger on a philosophical basis than Kant's arguments for God's existence. Hence, Kant falls into this kind of dogmatism in a much more scandalous manner, let's just say, than traditional metaphysics. Those who employ traditional metaphysics would, or those who employ traditional philosophy would. Hasan Spiker then goes on to write, yet in his later book, Kant's Criticism of Metaphysics, Walsh points out perhaps the most glaring inconsistency in all of Kant's work. By an elaborate argument, Kant seeks to establish that we can have knowledge in some areas and not in others. We can have knowledge in mathematics By an elaborate argument, Kant seeks to establish that we can have knowledge in some areas and not in others. We can have knowledge in mathematics, pure and applied. We can arrive in science and in daily life at many different kinds of truth about things phenomenal. What we cannot do is know what lies beyond the bounds of possible experience. All our knowledge is ultimately rooted in intuitions as well as concepts, and the only form of intuition available to us is sense intuition. It follows that knowledge, in its human form at least, is basically bound to sense. But what of the claim that it is? Is that supposed to represent a bit of sense knowledge? In the language of our own study, were he to have been fully consistent, Kant would have had to have faced the vexed question of whether or not his own theory, that we cannot know things as they are, corresponds to things as they are, to nafs al-amr, things in themselves, as the Arabic term is, or not. If it does not, he has wasted volumes of intricate argumentation on a theory he knows to be false. And if it does, then he has achieved the very non-empirical knowledge of things as they are that it has been the purpose of his entire project to prove impossible, which in its absurdity also entails the falsity of his point of view. But of course, Kant never confronted this problem. How shall we mark off this knowledge of reality which is legitimate from other purported knowledge of the same general kind which is not? How shall we avoid admitting the main results of the analytic are arrived at by a species of intellectual insight which they themselves claim to be unavailable to human beings? It is to say the least unfortunate that Kant does not address himself to these and similar questions. Kant's subjectivizing project falls victim then to the dogmatism of its assumptions and the inconsistency of its application of its own principles. Although the a priori categories are not entirely unlike the general concepts or transcendentals, the umur al-amma, as the Arabic term is, in that they constitute the universal concepts that necessarily condition all objects of experience, they are in a considerable more important way very much unlike the umur al-amma, in that they do not uncover an underlying intelligible structure of reality. They merely project the structure of our subjective perception onto a world that we cannot truly cognize, precisely because of the shadow that they have cast. Hasan Spiker then goes on to provide the Akbarian, or the Arabian, so to speak, which is based on the Sufi philosophical works of Ibn Arabi, that school of thought's solution to this issue, where he writes that a particular is intuited directly in cessation, despite being stripped of the species nature and the umur amma and superordinate principles that have brought it into relief as a distinct entity, cannot stand up to scrutiny. Intuition construed as the direct relation of the knowing subject to the fundamental constituents of reality, is fundamentally intellectual in a sense that embraces the spiritual. Existences are variously distinct but unindividuated, or distinct and individuated, but all are distinct and therefore subsistent. Both forms of object are intellectually intuited before they can, in the case of physically individuated beings, be sensed. The distinction between intuition and concept as framed by Kant is thus false. Although doubtless facile parallels with altogether different philosophical contexts must be avoided at all costs, at risk of anachronism, there is an unavoidable extent to which quite different philosophical frameworks correspond, to a lesser or greater degree, to nafs al-amr, and thus possess a sufficient degree of commensurability that to make comparisons genuinely fruitful. And indeed Kant's insight that pure thought cannot achieve a great deal on its own without adequate matter is far more satisfactorily framed by Ibn Arabi in his distinction between the receptive and discursive intellects that we have already seen, in which such matter can involve revealed and mystical truths, alongside those yielded by sense.